All right, thanks for inviting me, or I guess I self-invited me. Today I want to talk about energy market reforms to enable a green transition. What you see here is a picture of a run-of-the-river hydro installation in BC. I don't know exactly the location, but Kurt will probably be able to identify the location. I want to give an overview of really, especially also to our visitors from Europe, about energy markets in Canada, what some of the challenges are, some of the issues, and how maybe we can use some market reforms and also regulatory reforms, not just market, to maybe guide us more into what I understand as a green transition. And you might differ with that, and you might have a different idea of what a green transition is. We talked about it today in the first panel quite a bit, but I want to know, what does a green transition mean for Canada? Okay, so here I'm starting with our neighbors from the south. This is the US Environmental Protection Agency, and that's how they define green power, for example. And we have conventional power, renewable energy, and on the does this work here? On the left there, you see Canada has invested quite a bit in conventional power and renewable energy, but looks rather scarce on the really green power. So what I will challenge is a bit like we are not really as green as we think, although we, as we heard today, we are very clean, but we are not necessarily green. So we have a lot of large scale, we have nuclear, we have oil investment, we have large hydropower, lots of large hydropower, and lots of new large hydropower. But this is not really considered green. Even if you were supposed to, we talk about voluntary green, if you wanted to buy as a residential user, you want to be really good, a good citizen, you buy green power, you're not going to get large hydro. Okay, but this is not considered green power. Bullfrog Energy will not sell you that. Okay, so that's one thing. So let's start on the left with the conventional energy, and that is the coal sector. This one, as we heard, is dying in Canada. We're going to phase it out, and this is actually one of the few energy sources where we actually import more from the US than we export, because we are using it for steel manufacturing, electricity generation, and we export a little bit to Japan, South Korea, and China, but really 76% of our imports are from the US. Oil markets, just quickly, I only have 20 minutes, so, but here, this is an interesting situation. Alberta, Saskatchewan, as we know, are major oil producers. They cannot bring resources to shore in quantities they like. So we've had a whole bunch of discussions. If you were in Canada, you have witnessed that, about pipelines, what are we going to do? We had several ones that were discussed and applied for. Energy East was rejected. Keystone XL was rejected by the Obama administration. It might come back, who knows? I put a little question marks there. Northern Gateway was approved with 200 conditions, but it's also dead now. And then we have Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain, which of course everyone knows is currently in discussion, and it has also created these trade wars, or what I call bitter grapes. Also, we have a global carbon budget. How will it affect the oil sands? That's a big discussion that we have. If we want to leave 2/3 of oil resources in the ground and worldwide, we need to have an internal discussion of what percentage of the oil sands will never be extracted. And of course, our Prime Minister has already slipped a bit on that and saying we've got to phase them out, and now they're asking when and how much. So this is all a big discussion that we need to lead in Canada. Well, but we're not quite there. And that's why I think we are partially in the mess we currently are in, that we have these kind of internal conflicts, people not sticking to what's in the national interest, because we haven't really defined the national interest. Then we have natural gas. Here we have Alberta producing 71%, BC 26%. Those are the major producers, and obviously here, although BC is opposed to pipelines, they're very in favor of natural gas and liquefied natural gas, where they put a lot of their eggs in that basket. Here we see a number of LNG projects that are, it's a little small maybe, but that are currently approved for 25 to 40 years. Most of them are in British Columbia, a few of them in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec. And then electricity generation. So here we see that we are fairly clean, hydro 60%, non-hydro renewables 5%, nuclear 15.9%, and coal 9.5%, but soon there will be no coal, and then a little bit of natural gas 10%. But you see, what you see here though is that differs quite a bit by province. We have hydropower provinces: Quebec, Manitoba, Newfoundland, Labrador. Yukon has also quite a bit of hydro, and BC. And then we have some that are kind of have a mix, like Ontario, New Brunswick, even Saskatchewan has quite a lot of coal, but also hydro and other sources, natural gas. And then of course Alberta, Nova Scotia still be quite dependent on coal. And then we have PEI, which is actually all wind. However, they can't do it without New Brunswick. They're also obviously connected to the mainland. But they do have invested a lot in wind, and then we have basically all these northern communities, and Nunavut is representative of that, where we have exclusively diesel power. So it's quite a divergence of mixes in Canada. And also what we see here, the first thing is there is no consistent market price. They all differ in prices all over the place. And not just between provinces, but also between residential and industrial users. If you look at Quebec and Ontario alone, neighboring jurisdictions, you see that the Quebec price is 2.5 times lower for residents than in Ontario. And that's of course causing also some political upheaval, where elections in Ontario are typically fought over energy in some way or another, as we see in the current debates as well. Electricity prices are just too high, and people don't like that. And what I will show you later on, that in most European countries they're much higher than Ontario, but they don't complain. So one question is, why are they not complaining there, but they're complaining here? Also what you see is actually between Quebec and Ontario, the industrial prices are basically identical, which is interesting. And then you see that prices otherwise vary quite a bit throughout the country. They're typically a little bit lower in hydro provinces. The electricity market structure is an interesting one. Andrew talked a little bit about Alberta today, and I think that's probably the most competitive market we have, or the only competitive market that we have. Ontario tried to deregulate in 2002. It was a bit of a failure. They rushed into it without considering all the aspects it had. They had to backtrack, freeze prices, re-regulate, and then also had to really engaging mostly in long-term contracts, including crown corporations that are delivering the hydro, the nuclear, etc. So it's not really a competitive structure. Alberta comes the closest. Nova Scotia has some kind of an investor-owned, utility regulated market with a wholesale open access. But most of the other jurisdictions, you can see, are very powerful, vertically integrated crown corporations that really determine what's going on in the electricity sector. They call the shots. Not only are they powerful, vertically integrated crown corporations, but they also have far more authority over energy policy as in other countries, because provinces have a jurisdiction over energy policy, as we heard earlier. So there's a combination of powerful, vertically integrated utilities and provincial power over energy that really lets them decide where the investments are going mostly. And the investments are, we have a lot of hydro, but those are major, mega hydro sites. If you look at the capacity in Canada, 79,000 megawatts. But those are not all cute little run-of-the-river hydro sites that I showed you at the first page. Those are major installations. And we don't have enough of those. We are still building them. And that's because we consider that as a clean investment. So that's a bit of a problem. Here's the Canadian Hydropower Association. 76,000 megawatts currently installed. But look at the potential. We can more than double that if we wanted. And interesting enough, there's a lot of potential in the West. That might be a good news story, because we could go away from coal and diesel more in Northwest Territories, Alberta, Yukon, and Nunavut. You know, if we figure out how to distribute the energy. But there's a lot of potential still in hydro. The question is, how do we build this hydro? Are we building it with large dam, large style, or run-of-the-river projects that are less intrusive to landscapes and other problems? Wind farms are also tend to be rather large, so wind power has seen a lot of increases in capacity installations. However, again, we have lots of industrial style wind farms, wind parks that are owned by companies, utility companies that are different than, for example, in Germany, where they are far more distributed and not on such a large scale owned by specific companies. That it also causes a problem on the landscape that I'll get into a little later. Here's the interesting thing, greenhouse gas emissions by sector. Really, it was discussed already quite a bit. The electricity sector is not the problem. The coal phase out will basically handle that. There's a little bit of natural gas that we have to look at. But here the big sectors are really transportation and oil and gas sector that we have to work on. Here is a trend in energy use by subsector. Interestingly enough, you see one of the biggest problems here is freight and shipping. Freight and shipping has increased by 79%. Energy intensity has increased by 6% over 24 years, while it has decreased in all the other sectors, maybe not by enough. The oil and gas industry is just the industry. It doesn't include upstream mining of the oil resources. But you can see that this is a big problem. Transportation in itself, commercial, industrial, the energy intensity hasn't reduced as much as we would like to see. And here, of course, the tricky issue now is fossil fuel subsidies. That's how we actually support some of our sectors. We have about, according to the IISD, we have around $3 billion in subsidy going to oil and gas companies for development, exploration, royalty deductions, drilling credits, investment credits, etc. And that comes from different sources, Alberta government, BC government, federal government. So this is interesting. This is actually an opportunity of maybe redirecting some of these subsidies to other uses. And I want to talk about maybe how we want to maybe spend these subsidies instead. And fair enough, the federal government is committed to actually looking at this and reducing these subsidies, phasing them out of lowering them, and there are plans about this. But we have to think about those. Now, of course, the biggest problem here is how are we going to really coordinate all this, all these markets, the fragmented electricity markets, the pipeline questions, the liquefied natural gas questions, without having an energy strategy. Canada is the only G8 country without an official strategy. We can get into this, why that is the reason. It goes back to the National Energy Program of the 80s. But now, of course, we do have a mandate letter from the Prime Minister, at least, that we are committed to actually say the word again. We are allowed to say the word Canadian energy strategy again. And it's more needed today than ever before with the current turmoils between the provinces. Last year, a year ago, the energy ministers presented a joint action plan, at least, and with some commitments, at least, to 4 priority areas: energy efficiency, energy infrastructure, which has actually, Andre Plourde talked about it today, improved regulatory review processes. They have moved on that. And also reducing reliance on diesel and remote community in the technology and innovation case, and also international energy exploration. But also we see things like smart energy grids, electricity grids, and exploring new and enhanced electricity interconnections. That's the other thing I forgot to mention is, of course, all the grids in Canada are not connected. They're all going south to the States. There's limited interconnection. There's something we are working on to improve as well. So to summarize some of the challenges, and I'll get to some of my points in the last 5 or 6 minutes that I have, is that the challenges here is that we don't have a coherent market approach to electricity generation, distribution, and pricing in Canada. There's a lack of interconnection. We have powerful utilities that focus on large-scale power generation in isolation, really in isolation, and no general vision or guidance on market reform and integration at the federal level. There's a lack of infrastructure for electrification to take off. We talked a lot about electrification, but we are lacking that infrastructure. GHG emissions from oil and gas and transport sector need to be dealt with. Pipelines and retaliation, and clean rather than green energy is the focus at the moment. That's a challenge. Here's a statement from the Minister of Infrastructure that a strong economy where we invest in new technology, where we invest in green infrastructure, allows us to not only make our communities green, but also allows us to create jobs. So this is one example of our green infrastructure, Site C in BC. Also a very controversial investment, and refurbishment of Darlington nuclear power sector. Green infrastructure investment, according to Renew Canada, recently published its annual top 100 biggest infrastructure project. And look at this. The top 5 there are Bruce nuclear refurbishment, Darlington nuclear refurbishment, Musqueam Falls project, Site C, and so this is where we are putting our investment into. But the truth about green infrastructure is, of course, very different, because we saw the protests in Musqueam Falls, where we have large hydro that we know can also produce methyl mercury poisoning, landscape changes, using indigenous land, etc., which has become very controversial. Plus, we're building a very inefficient new transmission grid that we don't really need to build, but we don't want to move, and Newfoundland and Labrador does not want to collaborate with Quebec to move the power the other way. So we are building a new infrastructure that might also have an impact on the lobster fishery in Cape Breton. So this is something that, of course, we are not taking into consideration. What will a green transition inquire? Include all environmental, economic, and social impacts of the energy supply chain. New economic direction, knowledge-based economy, smart grids, EVs, green technologies. I don't think that's where we're investing our money right now. Increased electrification, new employment, smart system and prosumers, local and better balancing of demand and supply, and a transition from this large-scale, isolated provincial power generation to integrated, more distributed, less intrusive technologies. And so, for me, the green transition in Canada looks like this. More mining. Because those are the things that we really need for the green transition: graphite, nickel, aluminum, copper, lithium, cobalt, manganese. This is what Bloomberg is estimating, how these demands will surge as we transition into electrification, wind turbines, electric vehicles. All these are needed, and yes, they all are available in Canada. Good news. So we will not see a decline of mining that soon. It's an opportunity that some people in the mining exploration are already seeing, but that we are not seeing as a vision yet, either on the provincial, territorial, or federal level. And here quickly also, 2 minutes left, I know. This is the electricity prices. Look at Germany. In 2011 power purchasing parity, 32 cents per kilowatt hour. Canada at the bottom was 8. Why is this possible? And there's no upheaval in Germany while every Ontario election is fought over electricity prices. And it comes back to, of course, the energy transition in Germany, the Energiewende. A recent publication shows was made possible because of energy democracy. Because guess who owns all these resources? It's 51% private individuals. Farmers, project firms, investment funds, and look, the big 4 energy suppliers only 6.5%. So if you're an owner of these resources, of course you don't mind if your prices go up, because it goes back into your pocket. You're also making money off these investments. So then you have much more of a buy-in of rising electricity prices. We haven't done this in Ontario. So here's, I won't go into the details of the Ontario long-term energy plan, because I need to finish up with my conclusion, I believe. So here I would just say the Ontario long-term energy plan has some interesting directions, some interesting ideas that are moving us more into a green transition, I think. It's probably not enough, but it has some interesting ideas. So the reform suggestion, just to summarize, that I would throw out here is that energy strategy that accompanies the pan-Canadian framework on climate change. We need one to guide energy market integration, grid interconnection, as well as the future of oil and gas. We need storage markets, capacity, wholesale balancing, and auxiliary service, just as the UK has done. And they have very aggressive targets to get more incentive for people actually to sell their storage opportunities, especially as they invest in solar panels and in electric vehicles, etc. Contestability of these vertically integrated markets. We need minimum connectedness between the provinces, like in the EU regulation, between, for example, Spain and France. Better access to grids and transmission charges by use, also free entry of independent power purchasers. Incremental capacity auctions, as Ontario has suggested. Green technology innovation and trade development from clean to green. And also more distributed consumption and production, net metering, ownership of energy system by private owners, cooperatives, farmers, empowerment of remote communities and indigenous people as active market participants and regulatory decision makers. I haven't gone down that route. That's a whole different presentation. But very important, especially as we are in truth and reconciliation in Canada. Active balancing of demand and supply through demand response. We talked about that a bit earlier today. Wide involvement of consumers as energy brokers and not just as consumers. And finally, shifting subsidies from fossil fuel industry to renewable electrification and a mining sector that could enable a green transition in Canada, where we don't just build electric vehicles, buy them, but we build them here. We use our mining industry and our expertise to actually add value to these products, produce them here, and then use them here and keep them here.
Thanks so much.